Three things happened this week that most people are treating as separate stories. Story 1. Oil hit $92 a barrel, up $12 in a single session, wiping $110 billion from the crypto market and $1.1 trillion from equities in 24 hours. Story 2. The White House and Senate Republicans are now moving the Clarity Act forward without bank support, with a banking committee markup targeted for late March. Story 3. A senior U.S. congressman said publicly that RLUSD and the XRP infrastructure may be the most viable path to maintaining dollar dominance as the world's reserve currency without a government-issued CBDC. Now, here is the question the crowd is not asking. What if those three stories are not separate? What if the macro pressure currently crushing risk assets is the same force that accelerates the U.S. government's urgency to establish digital dollar infrastructure? And what if Ripple is the only private company positioned to deliver it? That is what we are decoding today. Let's build the picture. Welcome back to the Calm Analyst. We separate signal from noise calmly, structurally, without the panic. Today, we connect the macro storm, the Clarity Act timeline, and the RLUSD digital dollar thesis into one coherent picture. Let's get into it. Here is the hard truth that the fearful retail investor needs to understand right now. The macro environment is genuinely challenging. Oil at $92 a barrel is not noise. For every $10 rise in oil, the Fed's own research shows inflation increases by approximately 20 basis points. Oil has moved from $55 to $92. That is a $37 surge, implying roughly 60 basis points of additional inflation pressure. CPI was already at 2.4%. We are now looking at a trajectory toward 2.9, potentially 3.22. If oil holds above $95 and if Qatar's projection of $150 per barrel materializes, the model shows CPI approaching 4.3%. That means the Fed is trapped. They cannot cut rates with inflation rising. They cannot raise rates with an economy already showing the second largest monthly job loss since the pandemic. That is the definition of stagflation. Prices going up while the economy contracts simultaneously. The last time America navigated that combination was the 1970s, and it took a decade to resolve. I am not going to tell you this is nothing. It is something, and it is creating real short-term pressure on risk assets, including crypto. But here is the hidden mechanism that the fearful crowd is completely missing. Stagflation does not destroy the case for digital asset infrastructure. It accelerates it. When the traditional monetary system is visibly under stress, when bond yields are elevated, gold is at historic highs, oil is weaponized geopolitically, and the Fed has no clean move. The urgency for an alternative financial architecture does not decrease. It compounds, and the U.S. government is not unaware of this. They are watching the same data. They see the dollar's reserve currency status under pressure from every direction, rising yields making debt service more expensive. Traditional treasury buyers like China and Japan reducing exposure and a global financial system increasingly questioning dollar dominance. The solution they are reaching for is not a government-issued CBDC. Congress has explicitly moved against that. The solution is private stablecoin infrastructure backed by U.S. Treasuries operating on regulated blockchain rails extending dollar dominance into the digital economy without the political liability of a central bank digital currency. And there's exactly one company whose stablecoin is already held in reserves at BNY Mellon, approved by the New York Department of Financial Services, pending OC Trust approval, and whose CEO is in the room at the White House every time the important negotiations happen. That company is Ripple. That stablecoin is RLUSD. Let's put the structural math on the table. The U.S. Treasury market is $30 trillion. Every compliant dollar-backed stablecoin in circulation must be backed by short-term U.S. Treasuries. The larger the RLUSD market grows, the more mandatory Treasury demand is created. Demand the U.S. government desperately needs as traditional foreign buyers reduce exposure. Here is the geopolitical math that makes RLUSD strategically critical. The congressman's statement this week was precise. The opportunity is to dollarize the global south. 2 billion people in emerging markets currently operate outside the dollar-denominated financial system. Not by choice, but by access. They do not have U.S. bank accounts. They cannot easily hold dollar-denominated assets, but they have smartphones. And a dollar-backed stablecoin on a regulated blockchain rail gives every one of those 2 billion people access to dollar-denominated value storage and transfer instantly for fractions of a cent. That is not a crypto narrative. That is a U.S. foreign policy tool, and the U.S. government knows it. Now layer XRP on top. Every dollar of RLUSD that moves, whether across the global south, through MasterCard settlement layer, through G-Treasury's corporate payment rails, or through Hidden Road's $10 billion daily prime brokerage volume, requires a settlement infrastructure. The XRP ledger settles in 3 to 5 seconds. Fixed supply of 100 billion tokens. Exchange reserves near multi-year lows. The demand math against a shrinking liquid supply does not change because oil spiked. It strengthens because the urgency for the infrastructure that RLUSD runs on is now being driven by forces far larger than the crypto industry alone, and this is exactly the kind of connection that this channel exists to make. The oil story, the stagflation story, and the RLUSD digital dollar story are not 3 separate videos. They are one structural thesis, and almost nobody in this space is connecting them with the rigor they deserve. We do that here every week without the noise. If this breakdown is giving you a framework the headlines weren't giving you, subscribe to the Com Analyst right now and hit the notification bell because the next 30 days are going to generate more macro and legislative signals simultaneously than any period we have seen in this market. You want the structural breakdown in real time. Subscribe now. Let's keep going. Let me show you why the RLUSD digital dollar thesis is not speculation. When the White House holds closed-door negotiations on crypto regulatory frameworks, Ripple is in the room. Not occasionally, consistently. Circle has been invited to some of the larger public events. Coinbase has a seat at certain tables, but Ripple's presence in the active legislative negotiations, specifically around RLUSD and the regulatory framework for institutional stable coin deployment, is structural, not ceremonial. The OC Bank charter application, the Fed master account pursuit, the BNY Mellon custody arrangement, the New York Department of Financial Services approval. These are not marketing moves. These are the sequential steps a company takes when it is building toward direct integration with the Federal Reserve's payment infrastructure. FedNow, FedWire, systems that move trillions of dollars per day. When Ripple achieves a Fed master account, RLUSD does not compete with the traditional banking system. It plugs into it directly at the infrastructure level. That is the architecture of a company that has been told in rooms the public does not have access to that the gate is opening. Here is where the legislative and macro timelines converge. The Clarity Act Banking Committee markup is now targeted for late March. The SEC has officially scheduled a public round on April 16th to begin the rulemaking process. Senator Tillis, whose vote is described as crucial for the bill's path forward, is now characterized as receptive with talks moving in the right direction. The White House has shared legislative text directly with his office. The signal from inside the negotiation is consistent. Both sides are working toward the minimum each can tolerate. That's not a failure. That is a compromise approaching its conclusion. And the congressman's framing this week removed any ambiguity about the urgency. We cannot hold up clarity any longer. Dollar dominance depends on it. When the markup happens, the institutional compliance gates begin opening. When RLUSD achieves OC trust approval, the Fed master account pathway accelerates. When those two events overlap, legislative clarity and direct Fed integration, the risk premium on every XRP position does not drift lower. It collapses. Here is the piece the short-term fear is obscuring. The macro pressure right now is real. The stagflation risk is real. The short-term pain for risk assets is real. None of that changes the structural supply dynamic on the XRP ledger. Exchange reserves are at multi-year lows. Tokens are leaving exchanges into custody arrangements. The liquid supply is shrinking, while the institutional and governmental urgency for the infrastructure RLUSD runs on is growing. Two forces moving in opposite directions do not stay in tension indefinitely. One resolves against the other. And when liquid supply is contracting and sovereign-level demand for the underlying infrastructure is accelerating, the resolution is not ambiguous. The window where this asset is priced as though RLUSD is just another stable coin is the window that is closing. The macro picture is genuinely difficult right now. Stagflation, if it materializes fully, creates sustained pressure on risk assets. Rate cuts get delayed. Liquidity stays tight, and retail investors who are counting on easy monetary conditions to lift crypto prices have to recalibrate their timeline. But here is what the structural analyst knows that the fear-driven narrative misses. The worse the traditional monetary system performs, the more trapped the Fed becomes, the more dollar dominance is questioned globally, the more the U.S. government needs a private, compliant Treasury-backed digital dollar infrastructure, the more essential RLUSD becomes. Not despite the macro pressure, because of it. The thesis doesn't break in stagflation. It gets stress-tested, and the companies with real infrastructure, real regulatory relationships, and real institutional deployment survive that stress test. The ones writing narrative alone do not. Before I close, if you just watch this entire breakdown and the RLUSD digital dollar thesis finally clicked into place alongside the macro picture, one thing before you leave, subscribe to the Com Analyst and hit the bell. The late March Banking Committee markup, the April 16th SEC round, the OC trust approval process, all of it is unfolding in real time over the next 45 days. I'm going to be here for every development with the same calm structural lens we used today. Drop RLUSD in the comments if you believe the digital dollar infrastructure thesis. I want to see who is watching the architecture and not just the oil price. Subscribe now. Let me leave you with this. Oil at 92 is a problem. Stagflation risk is a problem. A trap. Fed is a problem, and every one of those problems makes the case for a private regulated Treasury-backed digital dollar infrastructure more urgent, not less. The U.S. government cannot issue a CBDC. Congress blocked it. But they need dollar dominance maintained in a digital world. They need the Global South dollarized. They need a stable coin that institutions trust regulators have already approved, and the Federal Reserve can integrate directly. There is one company whose stable coin checks every single one of those boxes, and that company has been in the room every time the important decisions get made. Price is a distraction. The architecture is the reality. I am the calm analyst. Stay rational. The structure holds.